Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sonia Lee. I teach Asian art history at USC and also direct the East Asian Studies Centers at the university. I would like to welcome you all to today's very special event. This is part of our webinar series titled Regulatory Science, East Asian Perspective. We launched this series back in 2020 in response to the many health and wellness challenges we face at the onset of the global pandemic. It also represents a really exciting opportunity to collaborate with colleagues at the Health Science campus. Today is such a pleasure to welcome back our HSC partners, Professor Unju Pacifici and Terry Church, to talk about sustainability in the post-COVID era. Well, when we met to brainstorm about this event at the beginning of the fall semester last year, we thought the pandemic will be pretty much over by now. We're not quite there yet, but we thought it will be really interesting to discuss different ways to develop new therapeutics for a global population after we have experienced so much rapid transitions in the past 2 years. How to design and conduct clinical trials will be a major topic for today. So I will let our two speakers to talk more about this later. But first, I would like to introduce you to the East Asian Studies Center, especially for those of you in the audience who are new to us. It's been part of the USC community since 1975. The center is home to over 120 affiliated faculty across 40 departments. And we've been doing all kinds of events throughout the year, so I would love to see you at some of the other events as well. So please stay tuned for any announcements we sent. Now, for today's event, it will be about 1 hour long. So the first 45 minutes or so will be the presentation by our two speakers, to be followed by questions and answers. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our two speakers today. Dr. Unju Pacifici is Associate Professor and Chair of the Regulatory and Quality Sciences in the School of Pharmacy at USC. She's also the Associate Director of the D.K. Kim International Center for Regulatory Science at USC that specializes in generating knowledge, tools, and skills for the development of innovative, safe, and effective biomedical products. Dr. Pacifici received her PharmD and PhD in toxicology from USC. She has extensive experience in the biotechnological industry to conduct clinical research with special focus on the Asia Pacific and Latin American region. Dr. Terry Church is Assistant Professor in Regulatory and Quality Sciences in the School of Pharmacy at USC. He is Assistant Director of Undergraduate Education and teaches in the Pharmacology undergraduate program. Dr. Church received his PhD, Doctor of Science and Master of Science in Regulatory Science from USC. He has also an MA in Cultural Anthropology and a BA in Social Sciences. Professor Church's academic focus is on interdisciplinary applications of pharmaceutical regulation in relation to patterns of addiction, disaster management, education, and training. Now, let me turn over to both speakers, and please join me with a very warm welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having us. Let me go ahead and share my screen and let me know if this does not work.
Looks good.
Looks good. Excellent. Thank you. Let me minimize the faces so that there we go. Very good. You know, working in this Zoom environment, it's hard to navigate because your screen has all kinds of stuff when you're trying to present, and you know sometimes you can't even see what you've written on your slides because you have some faces. So, but we're all getting better at this, right? So, hello everyone. It is really great to be collaborating again with our colleagues in the East Asian Studies Center for this seminar series. You know, as Sonia mentioned, we were hoping that we will be having this in person, but we are just not quite there yet, almost, but so hopefully next time. So today we will focus our attention on the concept of sustainability from a regulatory science perspective. I am again joined by my fellow faculty in our department and my partner in crime, Dr. Terry Church. We love to do these new exploratory projects together. So this has been really very gratifying because this is exactly the type of activity we like to embark on, where we're bringing different audiences and discussing these topics that cross disciplines and cross boundaries. So, not only in terms of, kind of the way we think about medical products, but we're also thinking about boundaries in terms of national and regional boundaries. So we have a number of topics that we want to cover. I'm not so sure how many of these. We're always more ambitious with our slides than we should be. So we'll see how it goes. We want to make sure that we do leave some time at the end for questions and discussion. So we want to really focus on changes in how new therapeutics are developed for a global population. And you can see from here the list of topics that we want to cover during the hour. When we think about new therapeutics, the goal of the industry, academia, and regulators is to develop products for a global population in order to provide treatments for patients all over the world who would benefit. But there are challenges in providing global access. We'll focus today on patients who receive the new therapeutics, professionals who work to develop and commercialize them, and the changing landscape for conducting the work. So when we think about access to medicines, we do not have uniform access. We do not have uniform access within our country, and we do not have uniform access across the world. In fact, according to a recent paper, nearly 2 billion people have no access to basic medicines, causing a cascade of preventable misery and suffering. According to WHO, looking at their 10-year retrospective, they see that their unequal access to medicines, unequal access to healthcare is really a vexing problem. And even though the 10-year retrospective was for 2007 to 2017, we have been seeing disparities, healthcare disparities, that really impact all of us during these past 2-3 years during the pandemic. A significant proportion of the world's population, especially in developing countries, has yet to derive much benefit from innovations that are commonplace elsewhere. So, we see a lot of advertisements in the United States for these new treatments for asthma, for cancer, for diabetes. But we have to keep in mind that much of the world does not have access to these products that are now widely accessible in our country. The issue of fair pricing is there are two concepts. These new products that we see on TV are very expensive. There are two parts to it. Prices that are so high that they are unaffordable, even in the world's richest countries. And prices so low, they drive high quality manufacturers out of the market, leading to drug shortages in various regions. So, the industry that develops, manufactures, and commercializes these innovative products are businesses. So it has to make business sense to them. And when prices are so low, they preclude profits, and the companies end up leaving the market. And then Oftentimes, we also see gaps in local healthcare systems and infrastructures hamper the delivery of medicines to millions of people. Now, we saw that with vaccines, right? We had this record-breaking progress in terms of bringing vaccine to the market within a year. It's completely unheard of in history. But then we saw the bottleneck in distribution and shots in arm. So, but this is, we saw it in a more local and regional perspective, but you can imagine it in a global perspective. It gets really amplified. But healthcare disparities can have global consequences. Here you can see what happened with vaccines. The red circles denote when the responsible microbe has been identified, while the yellow circles denote when the first vaccine is developed. But then you see how long it takes to get most of the world vaccinated. 75% vaccinated, denoted by the darker green circles. And the lag time is denoted by the time when the first vaccine is developed to when the 75% of the world's population is vaccinated. So that is what we mean by disparity in access to medicines. One thing that is interesting here you can see that how smallpox is an outlier in this whole scheme, in that it was developed without identifying the microbe first. The distribution, the importance of rapid distribution and administration of vaccines was seen in the most recent spreading of the Omicron variant of COVID-19 that only took 3 weeks to travel around the world. In the case of COVID, which has been the vaccine development, which has been a success story for the unprecedented speed in which safe and effective vaccine was developed, the heterogeneity in vaccination rates has had impact in our ability to control the spread as well as the emergence of new variants. Here we're just looking at the countries that are within the APEC region, and even that we can see a great variability in terms of vaccination rates. So access to healthcare has many components, including economical factors, healthcare coverage, and even political elements. But in our field, we focus on the regulatory science perspective, including approaches to achieve convergence and harmonization. By coming to an agreement on common standards and processes by different regions, different countries, we can minimize redundancies and thereby reduce time, resources, and effort to bring new therapeutics to patients all over the globe. It's been a challenging process. 30, 40 years ago, there were a lot of redundancies because each country wanted to see their own data in their own format. And so that resulted in a lot of duplication of effort. The harmonization and convergence approaches allow the reuse of data from one jurisdiction for others for a more efficient clinical trial process. The harmonization efforts have been underway since 1990s, and there have been significant progress to date, but we are still far from having a single path to a global market. There isn't a single regulatory agency that oversees and can approve a product for global use. And understandably so, medical products have inherent risk of harm, so each nation has its own regulatory authority to oversee which products are allowed in their country. For some activities like the quality standards for conducting clinical trials, or what we call good clinical practice or GCP, international harmonization has resulted in successful outcome in the form of ICH GCP standard that is accepted pretty much worldwide. But for many others, regulatory convergence may be a more feasible approach. So, there are two terms here: the regulatory harmonization and regulatory convergence. And regulatory harmonization really is challenging because it does require laws of the different regions to actually change and adopt the common standard. And that could be, quite politically challenging, and that could actually cause a longer lag time. And over time, we realize that perhaps regulatory convergence may be a more pragmatic and feasible approach. So the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation members, or the APEC members, have been working on this concept of regulatory convergence and cooperation. And they recently published an article describing their progress to date. So before we go on further, and I thought this was kind of appropriate for this audience, let's talk about what is Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. The Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation is a regional economic forum established in 1989 to leverage the growing interdependence of Asia Pacific. There are 21 members whose aim is to create greater prosperity for people of the region by promoting balanced, inclusive, sustainable, innovative, and secure growth, and by accelerating regional and economic integration. So you can see the time frame of 1980s. That's when a lot of 1980s and 90s. That's when a lot of these cooperative schemes started and got established. So we talk about regulatory convergence. What does that mean? It would be more of a voluntary process whereby regulatory requirements across economies become more similar or aligned over time as a result of gradual adoption of internationally recognized technical guidance documents, standards, and scientific principles. These are the over time gradually becoming more harmonized. And then includes, of course, common or similar practices and procedures. It does not represent the harmonization of laws and regulations, which is really not necessary to allow for alignment of technical requirements and for greater regulatory cooperation. If we were to, wait for true harmonization, it really will hamper progress we have found over the last few years. So the countries in APEC are not only in Asia, but also includes Canada, because it's Asia Pacific, the United States, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, Peru, and Chile. But not everybody in Latin America either. So it's interesting who is included and who is not. So as you may be aware, there are so many of these different cooperative schemes that it gets quite confusing, and there's a lot of overlap as well. But APEC over the years has had some strengthening of cooperation that is pretty notable. And since its establishment, and since working on this concept of regulatory convergence, we have seen some remarkable progress that the paper highlights, and that is the progress over time in terms of joining the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use, or ICH. So over time, we have seen increased number of countries within the APEC region joining this harmonization body. Okay. And also increase in number of countries that have joined the Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme, or PICS, to reduce redundant inspections. So as I mentioned, with each country having their own regulatory authority, imagine if you're a multinational company producing a particular drug, and the regulatory authorities come and conduct inspections. Imagine having 100 countries, 100 regulatory authorities coming to inspect your manufacturing facility. There won't be time for workers to actually focus on manufacturing the product, because they would be constantly getting ready and participating in the inspection. So the idea of leveraging each other and minimizing the redundancies in the inspection seems to make sense. And so that really points to relying on each other's activities. So work sharing becomes really an important part of being able to sustain this process. It was one thing when, the 90% of the pharmaceutical market was represented by Europe, US, and Japan. It's another when, the pharmaceutical market is now so expanded. So within the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperatives region, we see a lot of cooperation across the different countries. So here what we see is those countries that are part of the PICS scheme and those countries that are not part of PICS. But regardless of that scheme, you have countries across these two boundaries that cooperate on relying on each other's inspections. So in addition to harmonization and convergence of standards, the growing need for talent in this regulated field is striking. The advances in science and technology provides many more potential products that need to be researched, developed, manufactured, commercialized, and regulated. Hence, we are currently facing a great demand in the workforce, but the supply of talent is limited. And so sustainability with regards to workforce is where I want to turn our attention to now. So according to some experts, there will be a need to hire about 3.4 million workers by the US manufacturers between the years 2015 and 2025. And it is estimated that 60% of those positions, or 2 million jobs, will likely go unfulfilled. So this is an area of high demand. It's not only the scientists or those with scientific background, because there are many different functional areas within the industry and within this regulated space that requires talent. So if you guys are thinking about potential careers, this is a field that's worth exploring. And if you want to discuss some more, you can ask myself or Dr. Church or any of our other faculty. So, and this growing skills gap is high on all the hiring managers' mind. 84% of executives surveyed in this particular study agree that there is a talent shortage. But when I see a number like 3.4 million, I'm like, that sounds just too fantastic to believe. So I did my own little research. I had one of our student researchers just do a cursory search by taking just top 10 pharmaceutical companies and top 10 medical device companies. And so she went to each of these websites, the company website directly, and just typed in regulatory and quality as keywords, and then tallied the numbers up in terms of number of vacancies. Now, keep in mind, there are thousands of companies out there, right? So, and there are many different fields like clinical trials and other categories. But just these companies, we saw within the pharma sector, over 14,000 openings right now, over 14,000 they're trying to fill. With medical device companies, over 20,000. So we need to populate the pipeline with talent to meet the needs of tomorrow. And the future of work is a topic for discussion in many forums, including APEC. We see that the future of work is not only about technology, although technology is changing, but it's about the people and the changing world around us. So technological changes, climate change, globalization, demographic change. We take a few of these topics and just explore a little bit more. Technology. The digital technology is here, right? We are still in the middle of digital revolution, but the access to digital technology is heterogeneous, and it correlates with the economies as measured by GDP per capita. And with growing technology, nature of workforce will change, as noted in this slide that describes the risk of technological substitution to be between 38% and 70%. So as some of our jobs shift and are substituted by technology, we'll see decreasing job demand in some of the areas, but then we'll see growing job demand in others. Along with the nature of jobs, location of work will be shifted. In this regard, the current pandemic has really accelerated our transition to a more flexible work environment. We are now able to conduct business almost from almost anywhere, right? Like having a Zoom meeting using hotspot off the side of the highway during a road trip, which I've done. Of course, that requires digital infrastructure, which is not uniformly accessible around the world, which is reflected in this slide. You know, working at home is really not feasible in some of the areas compared to others. When we think of current global economy, you know, Asia figures prominently. You guys study this field, so you know more than us. But Asia accounted for more than 50% of the total growth in air passengers in the last 10 years. About 3.5 billion, or near half of the global population, use e-commerce platforms. China has the largest e-commerce market in the world. So globalization really is putting Asia front and center, which is where they will be for probably at least another half a century, right? But Asia is seeing demographic challenges, you know, population change by age group. There are, you know, considerations as the population's age and the birth rates decrease. What does that mean? Well, that means that our workforce will age. What does that mean? Who's going to actually conduct the work? Moreover, you know, the changing landscape requires the types of skills we need that are more analytical and more complex, that involve more complex problem solving. So just remember this as you struggle to finish that term paper or develop that presentation for the course. We are trying to get you guys ready for the emerging workforce skills that are needed in the next decade. And if you think about the educational system, you know, some countries focus more on critical thinking and in teaching, and US is one of them. New Zealand is high up there as well. Australia and Canada are high up there. You know, and that's not surprising because, as Dr. Church will attest, we as faculty have been incorporating more critical thinking into our courses and our deliverables. And I guess we are on the right track. But as you can see, some countries still need to change the way subjects are taught and move away from memorizing information to critically analyzing the concepts. Because we are in the fourth industrial revolution that will create a paradigm shift in the way products are discovered, developed, and manufactured. mechanical, electronical, automation, digital, fusion of technologies that will blur the lines between physical, digital, and biological spheres, as you can see by the products for future that are depicted here. We'll see blurring of boundaries between products. It used to be to control diabetes. You would first prick the finger and get a little drop of blood. You would put it in a little analyzer, find out what your blood glucose level is, measure the insulin with a syringe, and then inject yourself. But now that's all integrated into a closed loop system where you have the sampling, sensor, AR algorithm, software delivery, big data all take place. What does that mean? That means instead of having blood glucose sampling 4 times a day, you're going to have blood glucose sampling that is continuous or more than 300 time points. So, how do you analyze that? So big data comes into play. We are looking at efficiencies and sustainability of clinical trials in global health. Right now, there is a mismatch in clinical trials and disease burden globally. Of the over 300,000 randomized clinical trials that have been registered in the decade between 2010 and 2019, only 5% of those trials were set in Asia, South Asia, and only 2% of trials were set in sub-Saharan African countries. So, we need to have a more inclusive process to bring patients into the drug development process so that we can have a more diverse clinical trial population that really represents the makeup of the world. What happened during this COVID-19? Well, there were a lot of clinical trials that got started. This is in April 2020 to March 2021. You see there was an uptick in the clinical trials that were started to study coronavirus. But it wasn't all good. There were a lot of clinical trials that got started, but those trials were not really high quality trials. Most studies were too small to show any definitive result. Most of them were less than 100 participants, and most of them were studying products that had really no hope of showing any benefit. Why is this bad? Well, it's bad because having patients on trials that have no hope of actually benefiting the population diverts patients away from those clinical trials that could actually benefit, and that those that have real scientific merit. So as we kind of enter into the discussion about clinical trials, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Church to continue the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So what we see with clinical trials, just in 2021 themselves, they're very expensive to get undertaken. If you look at it, we're talking about just about almost $40,000 per single patient in a phase 3 trial. And phase 3 trials require a lot of patients in order to get the data that you need to be able to move on to the next step, which is hopefully marketing of your product out into the general public. We're estimating that as of 2021, the entire cost to bring a single drug to market is around $2.6 billion. And as you can see in the graph here, it varies based on the type of indication that your trial is being conducted in, with pain and anesthesia being among the most expensive. Next slide, please. In terms of where the cost is being broken down, there's a lot of expenses that go into it that we don't oftentimes think about, especially as these trials become larger and larger and require more and more maintenance internally just to make sure that you're getting the data that you need into the system. And it covers everything from shipping, which would be related to drugs, to monitoring, administration and staffing takes up quite a bit, clinical procedures, all the way through to site retention and patient recruitment. Next slide, please. But there is a way for us to bring those costs down, and that is through the wonderful world of decentralized clinical trials. This is a new feature that we've started to see. And basically what you're doing is you are taking away a centralized location where people have to travel to that location to get all of their necessary study related activities taken care of. You're also cutting out the drug manufacturing shipping to that coordinator center, because now you can get it at a localized area. Patients can go to their local physician and get the necessary tests and procedures done there. Sometimes they can even be taken at home, which makes it very nice because now you're able to bring those costs down in a way that is useful and wonderful, I think, for the patients. And this really is going to be the future of medical product development. And COVID really taught us that we can do this and do it well. Next slide, please. So as we all know, there really is no place like home. And one of the things with decentralized clinical trials is you don't necessarily need to leave home for a lot of your patient visits. A lot of the data can be collected online. Drug can be shipped directly to the patient or directly to their primary care physician or even local clinic if that's easier. They can go to their local clinic for things like blood draws and other clinical tests that they may need. And it makes it a lot less complicated for the patient, which also helps us because that means we can access more patients without having the burden of having them travel thousands of kilometers or hundreds of kilometers to their local test center. Next slide, please. Decentralized clinical trials really are where we meet the patients. It's what we do to make sure that we are getting as many patients into the pipeline as possible by meeting their needs. Literally, instead of sending them to a centralized facility, which we would call our fully centralized clinical trial, where every aspect has to be taken care of at that local or at that centralized location, we can now do it through a series of localized events, including one's home. We're also seeing this hybridized model where parts of the study are being done in a fully decentralized way, where other parts still require that you have a centralized spot. Maybe that's where you go for your randomization and your first key visits, but after that, everything else can be done remotely, even through mobile technologies. Next slide, please. We've seen that this has helped to speed things up. Most clinical trials can't be completely virtual. Unfortunately, there still has to be some aspect that is undertaken where you either get a blood draw or you get vital signs that need to be checked in a clinic. So the true idea of a completely decentralized clinical trial may not be fully realized. Although when we reach the level of the Jetsons, although I might be dating myself by using that reference, when we reach the level of the Jetsons where everything is virtual, then we won't have to worry about it. But until we get to that point, there are aspects of a clinical trial that need to be undertaken under the auspices of a physician's office. The nice thing is we can start to remove that centralized place, that centralized location where patients may have to travel to, because now they can go to their local primary care physician and get the same tests drawn or the same tests read. Next slide, please. The really unique thing is that we're seeing a lot more sponsors are creating more and more trials, and a lot of them are hybrid protocols. And as you can see here, we have listed the patient miles traveled for a variety of different studies. So you have, for example, in the first line, people going in for their first visit, they may have to have a physical exam, neurological exam, other tests drawn. And on average, patients would be traveling about 89 miles to reach that clinical trial site. As you can imagine, that starts to limit the number of patients who we can potentially reach out to, because 89 miles is kind of a pretty long distance to go. Within this trial, though, the rest of the simplified or virtualized aspects were able to be done virtually or at home, including things like having a lab draw and drug testing. all done at the convenience of the patient's home with 0 miles traveled. Now, we probably should switch it to feet because, you may want to have your blood drawn in your own bathroom, which is probably a few feet from where you're sitting from your computer, or would be sitting from your computer. So keep that in mind. We're not talking about miles, we may be talking about feet. With the very last visit here being done at a mobile clinic, which is just about 23 miles on average from the patient's site. So as you can see, we are able to bring a lot more to the digital or remote environment, making it a lot more lucrative for patients to want to participate and to be able to participate. Next slide, please. There has been some unique ways that this has been adopted. And here we have a look at the UK, US, and France. And as you can see, telemedicine and consultation is the highest tier, meaning a lot of people are able to do that and have started to use that within their own environment. Now, the N itself is slightly misleading. So in France, you have 12, in the UK, you have 33, and in the US, you have 104. But still, these portend to tell us what can happen. And a lot of this was thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic, showing us that we're able to pivot and create decentralized clinical trials in a way that is meaningful and provide us with the data that we need to move forward. Next slide, please. With the decentralization of clinical trials, we also see the industry starting to expand and grow, which is a beautiful thing to witness. However, as Dr. Pacifici mentioned, who's going to fill the roles of those jobs that are needed to make sure that we're managing this thing correctly? Hopefully one day one of you or many of you might be the people filling these positions. If we look at the ecosystem that this has created in creating a decentralized model over a scale of about 12 months, what we see from April 2020 to May 2021, there's a variety of different forms of associations or clinical research organizations, as we call them, who are taking on different aspects of making sure that this industry is able to expand and able to grow, which means more and more jobs are being created at different levels. Next slide, please. Oh, could you go back one slide, please? I should point out that I got my first start into clinical trials with this company ERT that you see here under the merger of ERT and ECOA. That was my very first ever clinical trial, was with that organization many, many years ago, but it's nice to see them moving forward into this space. Next slide, please. So why would we be so focused on decentralized clinical trials, and what could potentially be the next frontier or the next big endeavor for this? And Asia Pacific is primed for it. You have a lot of rural areas that really are not necessarily being put into the clinical trial environment that you could now access. You could go down to more rural levels, more local levels, and enroll more people. More people equals better N equals better proof of what we're doing in terms of the science that we're trying to get accomplished. Next slide, please. So this idea of the Asian Pacific environment and decentralized clinical trials was recently reviewed, and what we have here are some of the results of that review. And what we found is that it is a larger population. As we all know, about 60% of the global population can be found in Asia, including a large number of people in the urban environment, about 2.3 billion, but even more than that in the rural environment, which we can now outreach to with decentralized clinical trials. We always want to make sure that we have a diversity in terms of who we are seeing in clinical trials, both in terms of ethnicity and geographic location. And decentralized clinical trials gives us a way to meet that requirement. One of the big things that we have a problem with here in the United States is finding a treatment naive population. In the United States, we are all in love with being polypharmacists. We love taking as many medications as we can for every indication that we have just to help us feel better, which makes it very difficult sometimes to find people who have not attempted a drug or had a drug that was in a similar class. Being able to do a DCT allows us to reach populations that may not have had access to some of these drugs or their analogs, which gives us a better pool of participants with which to develop new therapeutics and understand new therapeutics. Similar disease patterns is also an issue. There are conditions that are present in many Asian Pacific communities that allow for the contribution of data to a much more global perspective in terms of clinical research and technology being adopted. Asia Pacific consumers and industry leaders are known to embrace innovation much better than people in the US or even in Latin America, where access may not be as great, which makes it a lot easier for us to be able to push out this idea of decentralized clinical trials. And finally, rapid growth of the pharmaceuticals in developing countries. Asia is the fastest growing global market in terms of pharmaceutical sales. Next slide, please. And finally, China itself has really gone above and beyond in terms of embracing DCTs. In a few surveys that have been done by sponsors and clinical research organizations, China has seen the benefit of both virtual and hybrid trials. Although there are some concerns that still remain related to regulatory gaps and digital data collection, those can be easily managed. And moving forward, I think we'll see more and more of a call for these types of trials across Asia. Next slide, please. In terms of looking at the acceptance, this was a survey that was done in West China Hospital and Sichuan University in 2020. And as you can see, there's an overwhelming response to people accepting decentralized clinical trials, with just a few outliers being unacceptable and a few in the uncertain category. But the overwhelming majority are welcoming to this idea of decentralized clinical trials. Next slide, please. In terms of the types of components of a decentralized clinical trial, the same study found that most people would be very comfortable using e-diaries and questionnaires or wearing electronic devices. I mean, right now, raise your hand if you're wearing a Fitbit or similar type of mobile device. You're very comfortable with wearing it. You're very comfortable with looking at the data afterwards. Why not harness that technology for medicine, especially in terms of decentralized clinical trials? Some people are comfortable with receiving their tests at home, the overwhelming majority, and so on throughout the list. I won't belabor it by going through each of the elements. You can take a look at it. And in the essence of time, I want to make sure that we save a little time for questions. So next slide, please. And I think that will just about wrap up this section. Oh, you're on mute, Dr. Pacifici.
I tried so hard not to hear that, but I put myself on mute because there's some background noise here. But what would this, sustainability talk be without interjecting artificial intelligence? When we talk about decentralized trials, we're also thinking about intelligent clinical trials. And so because of the fact that the clinical trial phase takes such a long time, and it has high risk, and it is so labor intensive, we're always looking for ways of adding more efficiency and increasing the quality of this process. When I was working in clinical trials in industry, this was back when patients' information was collected in paper charts. And in order to enroll patients, we literally had to screen patients' charts one by one, going from site to site. But now, thanks to the electronic health records being embraced and being perfected across this country and in many of the other regions, we have the ability to use the artificial intelligence technology throughout the entire clinical trial process. So instead of screening patients one patient chart at a time, you can actually look at the entire electronic health record platform across the country. Not only that, you could, at the point of diagnosis, when a patient goes to see his or her physician, at that point, depending on the diagnosis, it could actually trigger a cascade of events that allows the patient to enroll in the appropriate or eligible clinical trial. And then once they are enrolled, they could participate in a decentralized clinical trial format. And the entire process will allow a more inclusive patient population, more diverse patient population that will provide a more high quality information that will allow the data from clinical trials to be more translatable into clinical practice. And of course, the other area is, including patients in terms of informing them of the outcome of the clinical trials as well. We do not do that very well right now. And as I mentioned, the idea of being more inclusive, the idea of having higher clinical trial diversity really allows safer and more effective use of the products that are discovered and commercialized. And that, in terms of being more translatable, that's where real world evidence and real world data comes in. Dr. Church.
Definitely. So when we think about real world data or real world evidence, next slide, please. We have to really consider how clinical trials are done. And I think that this graphic kind of shows it. In controlled settings, in clinical trials, we have a very tight set of parameters that we don't deviate from. The real world is completely different. You have all kinds of different variables that can get added in. Now we continue to collect data once we move from that controlled setting to the real world, and the real world gives us a lot of unique data to draw from. Next slide, please. One way of thinking about it is how we go about utilizing this real world data, this evidence that we've collected over time, maybe through adverse events or through concomitant medications that we've been tracking and gaining more information. Well, we can use it for our new drug approvals, for our label expansion and revision, and also for post-market commitments. And we do this through a variety of different types of trials or different types of approvals that we send on to the FDA, for example, in our case. Next slide, please. One way to think about real world evidence is the way that it bridges the gaps in which data in our normal brand lifecycle exists. So if you follow the dotted line, that is the randomized controlled clinical trial. And as you can see, there are a lot of peaks and valleys occurring between the development phase and the maturation phase. And that maturation phase is where we would consider being on the market or in the market. With real world data, as you can see, it follows a much more reclined growth. So it doesn't have the sharp peaks and valleys that the RCT has. And that is because the data that we collect over time as we go in real world environments can be added into our current portfolio, depending on the drug and depending on the indication. Next slide, please. One way to think about real world data is how we can use it to our advantage. So if we think about unmet needs, for example, we can look at a variety of different mechanisms that we are collecting, like disease mechanisms, burden of illness, even clinical practice, and we can use that in our pre-discovery and drug discovery phase, especially as we've collected this information. We can also use it to inform clinical and policy decisions in the post-marketing phase, things like pharmacovigilance, which I'm sure you've heard of in the past, but if you have not, that's monitoring and making sure that we are tracking all of our drugs once they hit the real world. But our sources of data have expanded. We've moved from just the standard submission of an adverse event form to the FDA. Now we have things like mobile devices and social media, and even pharmacometrics that are being done by economics organizations, for example, that we can pull data from into these real world situations, and they can help inform all of our clinical trial process from pre-discovery all the way up to phase 4 and beyond. Next slide, please. So to give you some idea, here we have a few studies that I have pulled data from. And
Terry, I think we're coming to the end, so maybe we could just kind of fast forward.
Sure. So these are all from Asian Pacific markets. And as you can see, if we look at the first one, Ambien, this is reporting the number of hiccups that people had that we did not see in clinical trials, but that occurred after it went to market. So by following this, we can get an idea of what some people might be experiencing, and we can then add it to our safety profile of our drug for future use. Next slide. And that's it for real world. Moving on to mobile health, although I think we should probably break here. If you are interested in learning more about this, definitely reach out to Dr. Pacifici or myself. We have, as always, we have gone really big and been ambitious, trying to cover as many topics as we could within the area, but we have a wealth of information that we would love to share with you. And at that, I think we can open it up for questions.
Right. Well, thank you, Dr. Church. As you can see, what the rest of the presentation, which just a couple of the slides left, really is talking about how to increase efficiency and broaden the inclusivity by using tools such as mobile health, remote data capture, and electronic health records. So the information by transitioning the information database from paper-based to cloud and digital space, that we can in fact completely transform the way that we have been conducting business in terms of drug development. So I think we're only scratching the surface, because this is a highly regulated space. I think the industry is rather a late adopter, because I mean, mobile health has been around for a long time, but industry will not really dive into this space until they feel that the regulators will accept that data that generated from these other platforms, and the regulators are now starting to do so. So we should really see a transformation of how products are developed and commercialized. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over back to you, Sonia.
So we did get one question posted, and we answered the first part of it. So I will ask you, Dr. Pacifici, about the second part. So the first part of the question was, are you noting trends in clinical research in Asia towards decentralized or hybridized designs? Yes, we are, definitely, and we talked about that briefly. But the question I want to pose to you is, what sort of views have the respective competent authorities provided as far as the sustainability of these newer practices?
So that's on the heels of what I just commented. This is one of these cases where the industry, and even more than industry, I would say the contract research organizations and other kind of thought leaders are ahead of the regulators. So in terms of, when these, for example, when a product is approved using complete virtual clinical trial process, well, because the clinical trial process is so lengthy, it takes a while for us to see on the other side of the pipeline products that are approved based on that kind of virtual clinical trial process. So in terms of how regulators see this, we'll see. FDA, for example, for real world data, real world evidence use, has been mandated by the recent law, the Cures Act, to consider it. And so they have been publishing guidance documents. So there is a lag time. So, and so we'll see. They tend to be rather conservative, and rightly so, because as I mentioned earlier, these products have inherent risk of harm. And so they want to kind of tread lightly at first.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much to both Dr. Pacifici and Dr. Church for this really enlightening presentation. I've just learned so much about what's going on. I mean, it seems like there's so much things happening in the past 2 years, and we are running out of time. So we'll just have to wait for another opportunity to continue the discussion. So I would like to thank you both for the really interesting and fascinating data that they have brought to us today. And I'd also like to thank the audience for spending an hour with us today. And I hope to see you all at some point at other events that we have at the East Asian Study Center. Good afternoon. Bye.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lee. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.